The entire dining room fell silent when the young woman calmly walked to the head of the table, pulled out the chair everyone knew belonged to the wife, and sat down. She didn't hesitate. She didn't even look nervous. Instead, she smiled as if she had every right to be there. Across the table, the wife stood frozen, a folded napkin trembling between her fingers. Her husband said nothing. His mother lowered her eyes. Nobody seemed willing to speak. Then an elderly woman slowly pushed herself away from the table. She stood up, and when she finally spoke, every person inside that mansion went completely still. Before we continue, if you believe kindness, loyalty, and second chances can truly change someone's life, take a moment to like this story, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to Kindness Thread. Your support helps us continue sharing emotional stories like this. For 6 years, Elena believed marriage meant staying beside someone no matter how difficult life became. She had married Daniel when they were both struggling. Back then, they lived in a tiny apartment with barely enough room for the two of them. They shared one aging car, watched every dollar they spent, and celebrated their first anniversary with a homemade meal because going to a restaurant simply wasn't possible. Elena never complained. When Daniel decided to start a business, she became his biggest supporter. She worked late into the night helping him organize invoices, answer emails, and prepare documents. Whenever an investor rejected him or another business deal fell apart, Elena was there to remind him not to give up. She believed they were building their future together. And eventually, Daniel's company succeeded. The little apartment was replaced by a huge mansion. The old car was replaced by expensive vehicles. Daniel's name began appearing in business magazines, and people who once ignored him suddenly wanted his attention. But something else changed. As Daniel's wealth increased, the distance between him and Elena seemed to grow even faster. At first, Elena convinced herself that he was simply busy. Then came the late nights, the unexplained meetings, the constant excuses. Daniel stopped asking how her day had gone. He stopped noticing when she was exhausted. Even when she spoke, he often seemed more interested in his phone than in his wife. Eventually, Elena discovered why. There was another woman. Her name was Vanessa. She was younger, confident, beautifully dressed, and increasingly visible at Daniel's business events. Elena found photographs of them together. Then she found messages. There was no longer any reasonable explanation for what was happening. Still, Elena didn't scream. She didn't throw anything. She didn't embarrass Daniel in front of his employees or friends. She simply asked him one question. Did their marriage still mean anything to him? Daniel couldn't answer. And somehow, that silence hurt Elena more than any confession could have. But Elena didn't immediately leave the mansion. There was someone she couldn't bring herself to abandon. Daniel's grandmother, Margaret. Margaret had never treated Elena like an outsider. From the beginning, she had welcomed her like a granddaughter. While everyone else admired Daniel's wealth and success, Margaret remembered something they had forgotten. She remembered who had been there when Daniel had nothing. She remembered Elena. And Margaret had recently been recovering from an illness. Elena refused to walk away from her. Every morning, Elena brought Margaret breakfast. She helped organize her medicine, sat beside her when she was lonely, and stayed nearby whenever Margaret needed someone to talk to. Margaret noticed everything. She noticed Elena's sadness. She noticed Daniel's distance. And she knew much more than she ever said. Then came the family dinner that changed everything. Daniel was hosting an important gathering. At the mansion, relatives were coming. Business associates were coming. And Vanessa was invited. Elena spent the entire afternoon helping prepare the dining room. She arranged the flowers, checked the table settings, and made sure Margaret's favorite dishes were prepared. Some part of Elena still hoped Daniel would finally be honest with her. Instead, when the guests began arriving, Vanessa walked through the front doors. She wore an elegant dress and carried herself with complete confidence, as if the mansion already belonged to her. Daniel greeted her, without even trying to hide his comfort around her. He introduced Vanessa to several guests as someone who helped with the company. Everyone understood what that really meant. Nobody challenged him. Elena quietly stepped away. She had learned that public humiliation only becomes worse when you try to fight it in front of an audience. Then dinner was announced. Everyone began taking their places. Elena approached the chair beside Daniel. It was the same place she had occupied for 6 years. The place where she had celebrated birthdays, anniversaries, business victories. The place where she had once believed her future was secure. But before Elena could sit down, Vanessa walked over. She pulled the chair out. and sat down. Just like that. The room went silent. Vanessa looked at Elena and gave her a small smile. Then she reached for her glass as though absolutely nothing unusual had happened. Daniel looked toward Elena, but he said nothing. That silence told Elena everything. For a few seconds, she simply stood there. She remembered the early years. She remembered sitting beside Daniel when they received their first major business contract. She remembered how nervous he had been. She remembered him holding her hand beneath the table and telling her that one day, they would look back on that moment and realize they had made it. Now another woman was sitting in that exact place. Elena lowered her eyes. She turned around and began to walk away. Then, a chair scraped loudly across the floor. Everyone looked toward the sound. Margaret was standing. For an elderly woman who had recently been ill, she stood with surprising strength. Her face was pale, but her eyes were sharp. She looked directly at Vanessa. Then she pointed toward the chair. "Get up." Vanessa's smile disappeared. Nobody moved. Margaret's voice echoed across the dining room. She told everyone that the chair wasn't important because of the furniture itself. It mattered because of what it represented. It represented the woman who had stood beside Daniel before he had money. The woman who had sacrificed without asking for recognition. The woman who stayed when things were difficult. Then Margaret turned toward Daniel, and she started asking questions. Where was Vanessa when Elena worked late nights helping him build the company? Where was Vanessa when Elena sold her jewelry to help cover the business's early expenses? Where was Vanessa when Daniel's first major deal collapsed, and he came home believing he had failed? She wasn't there. Elena was. She had been there through every setback, every disappointment, every uncertain night. Margaret looked at Daniel and reminded him of something he had apparently forgotten. Success hadn't erased the past. It had simply made him comfortable enough to stop remembering it. Daniel's expression changed. For the first time that evening, he looked ashamed. Vanessa slowly stood up, but Margaret wasn't finished. She told Daniel that money could buy a larger house. It could buy expensive cars. It could fill a dining table with expensive food. But money could never repair the dignity of someone you had deliberately humiliated. Elena's eyes filled with tears. She expected Daniel to defend himself. Instead, he walked toward her, and he admitted that he had been selfish. He said he had mistaken success for happiness. He had confused attention with love, and he apologized. But Elena didn't immediately forgive him. She looked at him and said something that made the entire room quiet again. Forgiving someone didn't mean pretending nothing had happened. For years, she had sacrificed pieces of herself to protect their marriage. She had supported his dreams, protected his reputation, stayed beside him when nobody else believed in him. But she would not spend the rest of her life trying to prove that she deserved basic respect. Daniel finally understood. The woman standing in front of him wasn't simply the quiet wife he had taken for granted. She was the person who had helped build the life he was now risking. The following morning, Elena packed a small suitcase, and she left the mansion. Not because Margaret ordered her to. Not because Daniel forced her out. She left because she had finally realized something. Choosing herself wasn't cruelty. It was self-respect. Months passed. Daniel began therapy. He stepped away from the company for a while and started confronting the damage he had caused. He didn't demand that Elena return. He didn't pressure her. Instead, he learned to respect the boundaries she had created. Margaret stayed close to Elena. She encouraged her to create a future that belonged to her, rather than continuing to live inside someone else's shadow. Eventually, Elena started something of her own. She created a small foundation that helped women who had sacrificed careers, opportunities, and personal dreams for their families. Daniel supported the foundation, but he asked for nothing in return. A year later, Elena returned to the mansion. It was Margaret's birthday. The dining room looked almost exactly as it had the night everything changed. The flowers were arranged beautifully. The table was covered with fine dishes. And there it was. The same chair. Daniel stood beside it. But this time, Vanessa wasn't there. Daniel reached for the chair. He pulled it out. Then he stepped back. He didn't tell Elena to sit. He simply gave her the choice. Elena looked across the table at Margaret. The old woman smiled. Elena slowly sat down. But this time, she wasn't sitting there to reclaim a position. She wasn't sitting there to prove anything to Daniel. She wasn't sitting there because she was someone's wife. She sat down because she finally understood something far more powerful. Her worth had never come from that chair. It had never come from a husband. And it had never come from a mansion. Her worth had been there all along. If this story touched your heart, Like the video, share it with someone who may need to hear it, and subscribe to Kindness Thread. Because sometimes the strongest person in the room isn't the one who shouts the loudest. Sometimes it's the person who quietly survives the pain, walks away with dignity, and finally chooses themselves. And before you leave, tell us in the comments. I choose dignity. If you believe everyone deserves respect, loyalty, and a second chance, but never at the cost of their self-worth. Because sometimes the most powerful moment in someone's life isn't the moment another person finally chooses them. It's the moment they realize they can choose themselves.